And if the politicians who present themselves as defenders of the people also have mansions that are not only luxurious, but also armored like fortresses or real basements made of reinforced concrete, state-of-the-art surveillance systems, climate control, and inside, a collection of luxury cars whose total value could fund entire schools in marginalized communities in Mexico. Today, we're not going to talk about speeches in the Senate or campaign promises. Today, it's time to uncover a door that until yesterday seemed sealed by power, influence, and money, because it did happen yesterday in Villahermosa with Harfuch in charge. And no, it wasn't a routine search. 12 luxury cars were seized, 12 no-name cars, 12 no-name cars, 12 high-end vehicles, linked, according to initial reports, to the financial networks of Adán Augusto López Hernández and to suspicious structures that reek of corruption and something darker. Coincidence, administrative error, or a much more elaborate mess than a simple paperwork oversight. The models in question are not ordinary cars. We're talking about a Lamborghini Aventador, 3 Ferraris, including a 488 Pista, a McLaren Gran Turismo, 2 Porsche 911 Turbo S, a Bugatti Veyron, an Aston Martin Vanquish, a Rolls-Royce Phantom, and Mercedes-AMG GT Black Series, all found in underground garages of a mansion that, until yesterday, no one had publicly questioned. And the most ironic thing is the altered license plates. Some duplicated, others with false import registrations, because if you're going to keep a 10,000 peso car, at least make it look legitimate, right? But here comes the most uncomfortable part. The ownership documents, service contracts, even insurance policies bear names, surnames, and shell companies, some linked directly to companies where Adán Augusto has had a stake as a notary in the past, others to intermediaries previously implicated in money laundering investigations. Then the picture changes because we're not talking about a private collection. We're talking about pieces in a larger puzzle, tools for moving funds, emblems of power, and possibly vehicles for hiding illicit fortunes under the guise of political success. Now, we're not claiming that Adán Augusto drove the Lamborghini in secret meetings or that he's a Ferrari fan, but we are claiming that the assets of his entourage overlapped, even for a moment, with the same property, and that's enough to raise doubts louder than a car's engine. Federal intelligence leaked that this search didn't stem from a chance tip-off. It was the climax of a financial investigation that began with irregular transfers in bank accounts linked to notary offices in Tabasco. And when they followed the trail, they reached the cars. And when they reached the cars, the paintings and relics emerged. And when they reached the relics, the weapons appeared. And when they reached the weapons, silence fell, because while Harfuch detailed the operation without flashbulbs or microphones, the networks and portals were silent. Not a single main story, not a single segment during peak hours, as if the scandal were phobic of daylight. And so we return to the beginning. A simple but devastating question. How close can a political leader be to illegality without being tainted? Yesterday, we started with this bombshell, but what follows is even more disturbing. They say that nothing surprises anyone in Tabasco anymore. But yesterday, even the most indifferent looked up because in a discreet search, without spotlights or fanfare, 12 luxury cars emerged, sheltered in a mansion registered to names that sound better in electoral campaigns than in court files. Something doesn't fit, or worse, it fits perfectly. What was strange wasn't the seizure. What was strange was how it was handled, or rather, how it wasn't handled, because while the entire country was distracted by the latest controversy in the Senate, in the corridors of the Ministry of Security, whispers were too low for what had just happened. The operation was led by Omar Garcia Harfuch. He's no novice at this, but this time the ground was different. It wasn't a warehouse in the jungle or an improvised hideout with armed guards. It was an imposing mansion on the outskirts of Villahermosa, a mansion of more than 8,000 square meters with manicured gardens, infinity pools, and a security system that would include motion sensors and infrared cameras. There, after an 8-month surveillance of atypical bank transactions linked to construction companies and notary offices in Paraiso, Tabasco, the agents found more than just gleaming engines. They discovered a plot steeped in illicit luxury. The vehicles were immaculately parked with protective covers, charged batteries, and not a trace of dust. There were no signs of abandonment. There was no urgency to move them. It was as if their existence was not only tolerated, but planned. Lamborghini, Ferrari, Porsche, McLaren, all with valid papers. And property tied to companies. Formally registered in Villacentro and Macaspana, their common denominator. At least 4 of these entities have historical contracts with firms where Adán Augusto López Hernández acted as a notary before his leap into big politics. And yes, I know what you're thinking. What? Is the senator's fault if his former clients are the ones who signed? What relationship does the Morena coordinator have with the fake Bugatti license plate? Nothing. Or everything. Because when the fund manager repeats addresses, dates, and routes, this scheme is no longer random. The agents found not only cars, but also valuable paintings, antique relics, and illegal weapons. In the basement safes, hidden behind false panels in the main library, they confiscated original paintings by artists such as Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo, valued at $3 million, according to experts, along with pre-Hispanic relics such as Mayan masks and Olmec statuettes valued at $6 million. Most seriously, they seized weapons. 15 AK-47 rifles, 20 Glock pistols with erased serial numbers, ammunition for a small arsenal, and even fragmentation grenades, all illegal and without permits. The problem with this seizure is not only criminal. It is emblematic, because if the seized assets belong to any businessman, the news would spread. But if there's any suspicion that they belong to Adán Augusto's entourage, then it's best to remain silent, because in this Mexico, a position protects more than a bulletproof vest. And that was precisely what Harfuch touched. He didn't just seize luxuries. He also touched the facade of integrity built over decades with speeches of transformation, political alliances, and an image of unwavering loyalty. The operation involved units from the Army, the National Guard, and a financial intelligence team that has been key in previous cases but ignored in official reports. Everything was coordinated like a surgical operation, flawless, without prior leaks, without the press, because they knew they weren't raiding a nest of common criminals. They were tapping into one of the most solid narratives in Mexican politics. Hours after the search, a convoy of dark vehicles prowled the streets near government offices in Tabasco. No statement, no viral video, just a subtle dance. The same one shadowy groups have used to remind us that they are watching, that they are gauging, that they know who dares to enter. Well, they shouldn't. And yes, it may sound dramatic, but when 12 cars valued at more than 100 million pesos appear, guarded as if they were the inheritance of a Swiss tycoon, there is reason to be concerned. Not for the cars, of course, for what they symbolize, because the cars are just the beginning. The real discovery was the accounting framework that supports it. Contracts signed by intermediaries with direct ties to construction networks in Tabasco, shell companies, used to fake material imports, and most sensitively, the overlapping of these monetary routes with the same ones, used to move funds in areas of political influence. The internal report, to which we obtain access, reveals that at least 5 of the cars were purchased by entities with no operating history in Mexico, 3 of them incorporated in Delaware, United States, the other in Panama, all connected via a common supplier with a corporate name in the name of a longtime partner of Adán Augusto in the notarial sector. Added to this are insurance policies with secrecy clauses, underwritten by law firms in Houston, Texas. Minor details, but they outline a corporate architecture that is not only astute, but also armored to avoid leaving a trace on Mexican soil. Investigators also discovered requests for special use modifications in at least 3 vehicles' secret compartments. In the trunks, reinforced level 5 armor, and unauthorized installation of satellite GPS trackers. Why does a Rolls-Royce need that? Good question and a better reply. Nobody needs it, unless it's not just a car. It's not about accusing, it's about scrutinizing the design. Because when a senator appears indirectly linked to paths used by dubious interests, the question isn't whether they knew about it. The question is who chose not to investigate anything. The mansion where the assets were found has digital access logs. That implies there are records, there are footprints, there are recordings, but so far all of that remains under review, under analysis on hold. Pause for what? Someone can refute it, or everyone can get used to it. And that's where the case begins to irritate more than alarm. Because if Harf searches touch on the logistics of former officials, that's already serious. But if the rosy path in Adán Augusto's branding is involved, that's riskier because then it's no longer just about fighting corruption. It's about deactivating a validation mechanism that runs from notaries to political spectacle. That's why no one covered it up. That's why there were no questions, because the country isn't ready for it. To be the bishop between the lines, even with initials, because there are names that are not mentioned, even though they appear in the books, and precisely for that reason, this seizure wasn't just tactical, it was a warning. The question is, who was most affected? The person involved, or those who sold the narrative instead of transparency? But the silence wasn't just from the media, it was official. So far, not a single formal statement has come from the Attorney General's office, nor from the Financial Intelligence Unit, not even a "we are investigating." It's as if, in the script of power, someone had scratched this scene out, deeming it too harsh to broadcast. And while the cars are in custody, the paintings and relics are being evaluated by the National Institute of Anthropology and History. The weapons are being tested for ballistics, and the names, well, the names continue to dance between private files and lists that aren't read aloud. Because when a record appears with the initials of someone who coordinates caucuses and fills seats, the system responds, but not fairly, with silence. And Harfuch, firm, but also cautious because he knows what it means to touch emblems. He's done it before, and this time he did it again, but what's still unclear is how much support he has, because acting is one thing, sustaining action is quite another. And while all this is happening, history moves forward, even if no one narrates it, because when power collides with a reflection, it sometimes prefers to break it rather than contemplate itself. Now, with the luxuries secured, the routes exposed, and the senator's name circling near the shadows, the friction is inevitable. The question is, who will give in first? The cars were opulent and shone like prizes, but their luster wasn't just visual, it was fiscal. Because if organized crime and modern political corruption have been masters at anything, it's at laundering their wealth with refinement. And if refinement has a silhouette, the silhouette is undoubtedly a supercar parked in a climate-controlled garage with 24-hour security. One of the first questions that arise when discussing the search is, why luxury cars? Why not briefcases of cash? Why not the typical veiled transfers from banks and fiscal islands? The answer is as basic as it is annoying. High-end cars are highly valued movable assets, easy to register with shell companies, difficult to track when triangulated in legal transactions, and ideal for showing off without raising alarms. And here comes the most captivating part of the report that Harf confidentially submitted to federal authorities. The 12 vehicles were not registered as being owned by individuals, but by 7 different companies, for with registered offices in residential areas of Tabasco, another with an apparent base in Miami, Florida, and yet another, the Pearl of the Mess, registered in a shared office in central Tabasco, next to a construction company linked to Adán Augusto's projects during his governorship. Territorial coincidence? Maybe, but coincidences don't usually come with maintenance contracts signed by firms previously audited by the Financial Intelligence Unit for monetary triangulation, in addition to falsified license plates and inconsistent customs paperwork. The report revealed that 3 of the vehicles were insured with policies issued in the Cayman Islands. Up to this point, we could talk about tax evasion, but when you cross-reference that data with logs of private flights between Villahermosa and Mexico City, and with the list of employees at those companies, things get tricky, to put it mildly. One of the most surprising elements is that the import invoices for 4 vehicles included operating codes valid for heavy construction equipment. Yes, you heard right. Someone decided to import a McLaren as if it were an excavator. Because, of course, when it comes to going unnoticed, even the loudest exhaust can be disguised as machinery. But it's not all clumsiness. In fact, the operation behind these cars is remarkably refined. We're talking about companies with clean records, with auditors who have worked for multinationals, and with legal counsel that would endorse any signature on Paseo de la Reforma. In other words, we're dealing with a network that not only knows the rules of the system, it masters them. And here comes another name that makes people uncomfortable. Hernán Bermúdez Arevalo, former police chief in Tabasco during the Adán Augusto administration, with a history of investigation since 2024 for ties to groups like the Street Sweeper and unsupported financial transactions. His name appears, according to the report, in one of the accounting books found alongside unexplained bank deposits. This is nothing new. Adán Augusto has been linked to controversies several times, from his role as a notary, helping families with dubious properties, to scandals involving million-peso watches and family businesses under scrutiny. But what distinguishes this case is the prox impartiality with the figure of the senatorial coordinator. Because if there's one thing politics has, it's the ability to make sure no one questions it. The narrative shield works this way. An image of loyalty, effort, and closeness to the transformation is built. The character becomes an aspirational icon, and once that image is established, any hint of anomaly is seen as slander or an attack on the opposition. It's the ideal armor. The dilemma arises when that armor protects more than just reputation. In this case, the cars aren't just seized items, they're clues. Each one carries a story. Who acquired it? With what capital? At what time? Under what entity? For what purpose? And each story creates a puzzle that points to a corporate structure that, while legal on the surface, is aligned with typical patterns of money laundering. One of the clearest examples is the firm Construction Tab SADSB, created in 2018, registered as a supplier of materials for public works, and which in its 2022 annual return reported income of 40 million pesos. However, that same firm appears as the owner of the seized Bugatti Veyron, a vehicle with a market value exceeding 20 million pesos. The curious thing is that its balance sheets do not show the acquisition of assets of that magnitude, much less those for operational use. So, how do you justify a Bugatti in a company that sells cement? Easy. It's not justified. It's simply hidden, or it's assumed that no one will look closely until someone does. And this is where the story ceases to be anecdotal and becomes structural, because we're not talking about a lapse, we're talking about an operation that works with the complicity of notaries, auditors, insurers, suppliers, and, of course, officials who approve the investigation. If we follow the thread, we reach another disturbing point. Some of the seized cars have been inspected in repair shops registered with the Tax Administration Service, but whose addresses don't physically exist. In other words, the cars did receive service, but in places that aren't on the map. An old but effective trick. The question is, why all the effort? What's the need to triangulate, hide, and simulate? The answer lies in the usefulness of the vehicles. They are safe, fast, and symbolically harmless means of transportation. Nobody cares about a Ferrari if someone influential is driving it. No one finds a Lamborghini suspicious if the name behind it appears in photos with national leaders. The key is camouflage, because ultimately, these cars didn't just transport people. They transported impunity, and they did so with the elegance of someone who knows that status protects more than the norm. The intelligence report indicates that these types of maneuvers have become common in certain political circles in the Southeast. What's new and alarming is that these maneuvers now include names that have been used as examples of party loyalty. And that's where the system becomes tense, because if it's proven that these cars were bought with money of dubious origin, the problem is no longer just criminal. It's symbolic, it's narrative. Because how do you dismantle a story of dedication when its foundations are tainted? How do you rewrite the narrative if the protagonist is no longer untouchable? And then we come to the most delicate part, the impact, because this seizure doesn't just affect those directly involved, it affects an entire network that benefits from keeping the senator clean, visible, and useful. The appearance of these cars at the mansion is equivalent to a crack in the facade. It doesn't bring it down, but it does force us to scrutinize more closely, to doubt, to ask questions. And that, in a country where harsh questions are not welcome, is already a threat. The next question is inevitable. How far does the driving force behind this story go? At this point in the case, we are no longer surprised by the emergence of luxury cars, shell companies, and financial ties that smack more of opacity than transparency. What does astonish and infuriate is the dance of silence, because there is nothing more effective than an armored narrative when it comes to protecting what shouldn't be told. Since the report on the raid was leaked, there's been a disturbing coincidence. The authorities remain silent, the news outlets remain silent, and even the usual analysts declare themselves perplexed, not because of a lack of data, but because they don't know or don't want to choose sides. Because touching Adán Augusto is uncomfortable, and in this Mexico, disturbing others is expensive. The most revealing thing is not what was disseminated, but what was not said. Not a conference, not a bulletin, only echoes. And that omission is the most eloquent language of power. Because when the system chooses not to see, it's not because it's blind, it's because it sees too much and prefers to turn its head. The figure of Adán Augusto López Hernández functions in Mexico as immunity from scrutiny. His image is so ubiquitous that it has become a kind of civic dogma. He appears in forums, on social media, at events, partisans, in official speeches. He is an emblem of commitment, discipline, closeness, and convenience. Convenient for allies, for the governors who pose with him, for the parties that use him as a face, and for a state apparatus that requires him as living proof that progress can indeed be made without scandals. The dilemma arises when that image cracks, because if the emblem is contaminated, the entire message collapses, and that is the real reason for the silence. It's not for fear of retaliation from groups. It's the price of questioning a narrative that has served as a collective calming factor for years. Because admitting that the coordinator may have uncomfortable connections implies admitting that the system allowed them to operate. And that, politically, is a very high price to pay. Adán Augusto has not yet been formally charged with anything, and he probably won't be, because in a system that values image over truth, reputation weighs more than evidence, and that explains why the case progresses in secret, without fuss or media trial. One would think that in the face of an operation of this magnitude, the political class would come out in support of Harfuch, but they remain silent, because they know that what was touched was not just a network of cars and contracts. It was a figure that serves as a national shield. And in Mexico, shields are not touched. They are venerated, even if they are corroded inside. Adán Augusto's symbolic shield has two layers. The first is obvious, his track record. The second, more subtle, is institutional. No one wants to be the official who questions the most loyal former governor of the Southeast. No one wants to sign the paper that mentions him, and that's how refined impunity is built. It isn't imposed with force, it's defended with collective silence. That's why the story didn't appear in the daily summaries. That's why there weren't headlines with his name. Because when the official narrative is based on public figures, the system doesn't take risks, doesn't investigate, doesn't bother, it only protects. And that makes this case much more sensitive, because we're no longer just talking about corruption, we're talking about official complicity with narrative validation mechanisms, a sort of implicit agreement where emblems are not touched, even if they are entangled in shadows. That's the real danger. Because if power protects emblems instead of the law, then leaders become more powerful than institutions. And in that context, justice isn't applied. It's negotiated, adjusted according to the convenience of the moment. That's why he's been so meticulous, because it's not just about being bold, it's about being tactical. Because when you touch an icon like Adán Augusto, you're not just facing dubious networks, you're facing an entire system that has invested years in building an image that works for everyone. What's fascinating is that this case highlights something that many suspected, but few dare to say, that success without clarity is as suspicious as failure with violence, that the narrative of personal loyalty can no longer operate as a barrier to avoid harsh questions. And this is where the conversation deepens, because it's not just about Adán Augusto, it's about how many others operate under the same cover, how many other leaders serve as a cover for shady interests, how many mansions, cars, accounts, and agreements are sustained thanks to a well-placed position. The case is open, but stalled like so many others in this country. It's being investigated, but without haste. It's being mentioned, but without names. Progress is being made, but without repercussions, because no one wants to be the one to upset the balance. And that turns this case into a mirror, a troublesome one, because it reflects not only what was confiscated, but also what is being protected, and more crucially, who is being protected. So, let's get back to the basics. 12 luxury cars, 12 irregular tax records, connected names, cross contracts, and a public figure who, although not charged, appears too close to everything, yet, despite that, remains silent. That silence also takes its toll, not in pesos, but in credibility, because every day that passes without a statement, without an open investigation, without a clear position from the state, public trust erodes a little more. And the big question, the one no one wants to answer, is simple but devastating. Who benefits from silence? In Mexico, politics has its codes, its silences, and its scripts. No one publishes them, but everyone knows them. And if anything became clear with the seizure of the supercars linked to Adán Augusto's circle, it's that Omar Garcia Harfuch didn't read, or chose to ignore the script that says the emblems are not to be touched, because what he executed was a breach, not of a door, but of a pact. A silent pact between the media, politicians, businessmen, and public accounts. A tacit agreement where everyone pretends. That political success needs no explanation if it comes wrapped in flags, applause, and party loyalty. Harfuch knew exactly what he was touching. It was the first time he led a high-impact operation. But this time the scene wasn't a criminal haven. It was a mansion with sophisticated alarms, notarial acts, and clean invoices. The kind of place where irregularity isn't seen, but it is signed. And that's what's bothersome, because this case reveals something deeper, that true power in Mexico isn't measured only in votes or money. It's measured in narrative control. Who can navigate gray areas without being interrogated? Who has the privilege of not being singled out, even if their signatures appear on the same documents as a suspicious network? The search in Villahermosa was precise, but its echo was seismic, not because of the scale of the seizure, but because of the identity of what was seized. Each car represented something more than opulence. It represented official complicity, because there is no Lamborghini in a garage without customs clearance, no Ferrari imported without state paperwork, and no shell company that doesn't go through at least one auditor, a notary, and a bureaucrat who looks the other way. The problem wasn't finding the cars, it was registering the names. And the real scandal isn't that those names exist, but that no one wants to utter them. That's why Harfuch is isolated, because his choice to act not only exposed a dubious financial network, it exposed a protection structure that for years has protected those who possess something more valuable than economic power, symbolic power. And in a country where symbols are worth more than records, that's a threat. The authorities Silence after the search isn't negligence. It's a sign, because if you dig deeper, the costs are too high, not only for Adán Augusto, but for all those who used him as a barrier. Politicians, allies, media outlets, and even campaigns that used his image as a synonym for integrity. And then the dilemma that no one wants to face arises. What happens when the system needs to protect the emblem more than the truth? What happens when the story becomes an unwritten rule? What Harfuch did was remind the system that not everyone is willing to change. But in Mexico, anyone who doesn't follow the script pays, and pays dearly. Not with direct threats, with institutional erosion, with administrative blockages, with calculated absences from sessions, with files that don't advance. Because in this country, punishment for those who break the script doesn't always come from outside. Sometimes it comes from within the government itself. Mexico's history is replete with officials who crossed the forbidden line. Some ended up abroad, others in minor positions, others simply vanished from the public eye for no reason. They all shared something. They dared to touch the untouchable. And the most disturbing thing is that this time the untouchable wasn't a criminal. It was a senator, a coordinator, a brand. And that's where the system becomes more defensive. Because if an emblem like Adán Augusto falls, it's not just a person who falls. It's a model, an idea, a manual of national loyalty. That's why no one talks about the confiscation, because to mention it is to acknowledge that success can also smack of irregularity. It is to admit that not everything that shines comes from dedication and service. Sometimes it also comes from fiscal triangulation and silent allies. And while the operation remains on hold, the evidence is there, the documents are there, but progress is zero. And the question that floats in every office is the same. What to do with what can no longer be hidden? But it doesn't want to be spoken about, because once the emblem is near the file, the system enters a crisis, not because it can't be judged, but because it doesn't know how to tell the story without collapsing its own edifice. And this is where the Harf case becomes more than just a police action. It becomes a lesson in narrative power, a demonstration that in Mexico, true power doesn't need to hide behind masks. A smile, a speech, and a well-nourished symbolic shield are enough. The price Harf will pay for this is still unknown. But what we do know is that his move challenged a structure that until now seemed unchallengeable. And that, in this context, is revolutionary, because if the state starts to tamper with its emblems, then the system will have to decide whether to protect its image or the law. And that's where everything becomes more dangerous, because image, unlike the truth, is easy to reconstruct. A post, an event, a campaign is all it takes. But when the truth emerges, no matter how much disguise it is, it always finds a way to make itself known. So what's next? Will the case be shelved until further notice? Will a couple of intermediaries be sacrificed to save public face? Or will the truth be allowed to prevail? Even if that means reviewing everything we thought we knew about loyalty, legality, and merit, because that's what's at stake. Not a Ferrari, not an operation. What's at stake is the system's ability to look in the mirror and recognize that sometimes the narrative also needs to be investigated. And in that mirror, everyone will have to answer a simple question. Are you willing to touch the emblem? If that means telling the truth, sometimes the most scandalous thing isn't what you find, but what you decide to keep quiet. 12 luxury supercars, linked to corporate structures tied to Adán Augusto López Hernández and operated with the secrecy of official logistics, should have stirred debates, prompted investigations, opened files, but they didn't. Instead, we had a perfectly orchestrated silence. And that silence isn't accidental. It's methodical, structural, part of a system that doesn't protect individuals, it protects emblems. Because if a name like Adán Augusto's falls into the same folder as irregularities, the problem isn't just judicial. It's narrative, institutional, and structural. The discovery of the cars wasn't just a seizure, it was a crack. A crack in the facade of political, senatorial, and national success that has been built with campaigns, interviews, and positions of power under the name of transformation. And that crack, however small, shows what many have preferred. To ignore that legality in Mexico is negotiable, especially when image sells more than truth. The worrying thing is not that these structures exist. We knew that. What's truly alarming is that even when exposed, they remain intact, that the scandal has no consequences, that the names are there, but no one mentions them, that the file moves forward, but no one reads it, because in the end, all of this isn't just about Adán Augusto. It's about us, about how we consume comfortable stories, how we prefer to believe in loyalty rather than investigate the contract, how success reassures us, even if it smacks of adulterated opacity. And Harfuch broke the script and, in doing so, became uncomfortable. Uncomfortable for dubious networks, yes, but even more uncomfortable for a system that doesn't know how to protect itself when its emblems appear on the wrong pages. Because this case wasn't a blow against a network. It was a blow against one of the most ironclad narratives of modern Mexico. Now that we know, what do we do with it? Do we mentally file it away? Do we wait for another scandal to distract us, or do we begin to see things differently? Because if anything was made clear by this operation, it's that true power is no longer measured solely by votes. It's measured by image, by presence, by the silence that is bought when the emblem is functional. And that silence is profitable. It protects agreements. It protects campaigns. It protects investments. But it also perpetuates impunity. Because every time an emblem is beyond the reach of criticism, the system rusts a little more. This case should teach us that even the most glistening names can have their fingerprints in the mud, not because they're guilty by definition, but because they operate in an environment that allows them not to ask, not to look, not to be uncomfortable. And that, in a country like this, is not innocence, it's privilege. So it's not about destroying emblems. It's about stopping turning them into shields, because when an image becomes evidence, there are two options. Either we investigate or we become complicit in the silence. And that includes everyone. The media, authorities, allies, and even us. Because as long as we continue to believe that a face in the Senate justifies what's in the documents, impunity will continue to wear expensive suits and drive cars that are impossible to trace. The truth is uncomfortable, yes, but ignoring it only makes it more dangerous. And if this case serves any purpose, it's a reminder that silence doesn't protect peace, it protects privileges. So the next time you see a motivational speech, a partisan position with an official logo, or a new national unity event, ask yourself what else that image is protecting. What is it telling us? Because only when the narrative ceases to be untouchable does justice begin to have a place. Subscribe if you like the video, and here, we will continue to tell what others dare not say. We will continue to break the script when the script serves to protect impunity. If you got this far, it's because you don't settle for pretty summaries or prepackaged stories. It's because you also know that the truth is more powerful than any luxury engine. Subscribe if you like the video, activate the bell, share this video, because in a country where power is measured in silence, every word spoken is a form of resistance. And remember, what cannot be named is protected, and what is protected is also investigated.